So now welcome to briefing 11, first key points in strategy, where I will go through the background to the decision to ask the High Representative to go ahead to prepare the global strategy into June 2015. I will discuss the many arguments put forward in the debate for and mainly against conceptualization, discuss the difficulty of planning for the future. What if things cannot be implemented due to factors not under EU control, the tendency to push language towards more generalities and more references to the past, the fact that strategy can influence expectations positively, legitimize, contextualize, institutionalize procedures helping to implement the strategy. Generally focusing on defining not just the probable but the desirable futures, the fact that strategy is now much more linked to motivation and social psychology than in the past, as illustrated by the book on strategy by Lawrence Friedman. It's a way to focus more on causes than just reacting to symptoms. It's not a bad way to check what kind of resources are necessary in order to go ahead with something, although financial implications are often left outside of strategies, at least on the external side. Such endeavors are not often made, for instance, even in setting up the External Action Service itself. Need to avoid the risk of being self-congratulatory, likely to hit back later when new incumbents come into office, and the need to focus on strategy on the level of the European Council itself, not give away the lead for the strategy implementation to lower levels too much, and the need for the External Action Service and the Commission to use strategies to have staff see the big picture, both on the level of headquarters and certainly in the field. So these are some of the things I will be discussing now in a somewhat longer recording. This is a screencast version of a recording without me in the picture, more illustrations of what I actually want to say. So now we are going more into detail. We're going to use examples to illustrate the points more systematically. Why would you need a strategy? More specifically, why would you need a strategy on the very general level of a global strategy? Are not the transaction costs just in producing the document too high? Is it not just more effective to focus on implementation and more concrete objectives? And what if things go wrong and the strategies can't be implemented? What if they cannot be implemented for reasons outside your control? These are all questions that were hotly debated over a number of years in the EU preceding the global strategy. I'll talk a little bit about this in this briefing. If you feel that you need a bit more of background on strategy in the EU context, I would like to refer you to the sub-chapter on strategy in my handbook on EU and security. So let me start with the obvious question often put and widely debated during the years before 2015, when the final go-ahead was given by the European Council for the High Representative to prepare the global strategy for foreign and security policy. There were many arguments against conceptualization. Of course, it's difficult to plan for the future, and it's perhaps even politically dangerous to pin down in advance what one should do in response to future developments. This is even true on the level of programming, and let me take an example from the last decade, when we tried in the EU to set out a strategy for mine action, and this was in the European Commission in cooperation with the international community, the mine action community. It would of course have been excellent to be able to prioritize several years in advance where to do mine action. but we had to cater for the possibility that the level of crisis in different areas would change. So what could happen was that mine action, which by civilian actors normally is carried out in non-crisis situations, could not be carried out. Or that new opportunities for important demining could arise due to positive developments in new specific areas. Or that we over time could see opportunities to prioritize differently due to new progress in mine action technology, or for that matter, new information from space through so-called geographic information systems. Of course, priorities still needed to be set. Mine action is extremely expensive and time-consuming, and it's absolutely vital to know what will bring the quickest and most important results in terms of alleviating and preventing human suffering. But it was simply difficult to do it in very concrete terms, several years in advance. I would propose that this is not an unusual situation, that it in fact characterizes work in very many contexts in the EU global strategy. In fact, in many contexts, the situation may be even worse. Mine action, after all, is a very concrete endeavor with very visible results. Those who implement the projects do physical work where the results can be inspected afterwards. It's a very different matter when the EU action aims at influencing processes where other actors, not under EU control, are supposed to do the bulk of the work. In this sense, adopting a strategic paradigm very much influenced by military planning can lead to difficulties when applied to societal areas less dependent upon capabilities, scenarios, and a strict hierarchy of strategic, operational, and tactical planning sequences. And also in the civilian context, there are clear differences when discussing the possibility to develop useful strategies. We can illustrate through a fictitious example when the top managers of EU assistance policies are supposed to be evaluated. Those who have been most successful in terms of implementation of projects are likely to have worked in areas with less crisis and more positive relationships with the EU, and also possibly more developed societies. Those who are perceived to be less successful are likely to have worked in areas with more crisis, less positive relationships with the EU, and more fragile societies. So it's actually not that surprising if a project manager on a higher level shies away from the most difficult places, so it's sure to give him or her difficulties in terms of effectiveness and implementation. The more implicit the security considerations are in the EU policies, the more you are likely, perhaps, to see people focusing on working where it's possible to bring measurable results in a reasonable period of time. The more explicit, on the other hand, the security considerations are, the more decision makers are likely to accept risk of failure due to political imperatives. But this again is not a stable situation. Perceptions of political imperatives change, as we know. At one point, one issue is absolutely vital to focus on, only to be replaced by another priority situation in another context. So if you think that strategies are very vague, general, imprecise, what have you, there is a reason for this. There are in fact many reasons for this. So what does it mean? Why would you still want to produce strategies beyond the area of developing military capabilities or focusing on certain types of scenarios or exercises? Well, strategies help you to come a bit closer, not only to accept the future as it will evolve, but actually to define desirable future. You want to influence expectations, you want to legitimize actions, you want to put actions in a wider context, you want to institutionalize new procedures and help people to accept risks that need to be taken despite requirements of sound financial management. Strategies can help to explain to one set of people specializing in one area with this sub-strategy logic why something has to be done which needs to be prioritized due to considerations on a higher level of strategy. I mentioned in an earlier briefing the example of pursuing economic and environmental discussions in the OSCE, which from a more specialized perspective, intra-economy or intra-environment, would seem strange. Why would you pursue a dialogue on such complicated issues in an organization with very little expertise on the matters involved, with a consensus principle, etc.? Well, such dialogue could create possibilities for conflict prevention and conflict resolution, which are not readily identified by those working on the more specialized agenda. Again, more security awareness on the strategic level, notably in the European Commission, will help to make this obvious. That means that the processes here include the following observation. Many people, including Javier Solana, the first High Representative, have observed that one of the most important reasons why you need a strategy is to help people inside the organization to see their role in a wider context. And you do what I do now, namely to promote staff induction. The aim may not be in the first place to focus on things that people can find out very quickly for themselves. And again, to take the OSCE example, what's in the global strategy about the OSCE? Well, obviously just a few mentions of the organization. But if it then becomes much more interesting when you start looking at various dimensions of OSCE work, arms control, the human dimension, etc., and the specific regions under prioritized discussion in the organization. That is when you start to identify who needs to help out in order to invigorate OSCE work. And those people may be working with quite different overall objectives in quite different settings than these multilateral conferences and seminars or field missions of the OSCE. Let me take the concrete example of transnational organized crime and all various forms of trafficking, which has encouraged some of the most complex and at the same time innovative project designs ever on even on the level of the G8 in the last decade, mirrored by concrete major projects undertaken by the European Commission. It's easy perhaps to set out the goal of preventing drugs and human trafficking, but once you go into reality, you see very soon the complexities. And if you work in that area, you see very clearly the need for synergies between those working on internal security in the EU and external. The way in which such endeavors are designed and implemented must be linked to careful ex-ante analysis, an analysis before you start the project, where it's most useful to do work in the chain from source to destination, where could be opportunities for organized crime where one could see opportunities for organized crime to circumvent efforts by the international community. To illustrate with a specific border station built through EU funds somewhere in Central Asia, what if trafficking no longer goes through that road? Is that a measurement of success, or is it simply a failure of strategic planning to prevent circumvention? I could go on and on for hours about this, taking examples from different areas of the world, but I hope what I have said now already suffices to illustrate my very main central point when it comes to the usefulness of strategy. Already the process of producing a strategy is essential in order to force people to think through very complex issues and try to identify people that they need to help them, which may not have been identified in the first place once the discussion started. Sometimes such a process of identification of people who need to help out can lead to very difficult discussions and very controversial results. Let me take one more example, namely the issue of nuclear security, essentially the way in which the international community tries to prevent terrorists and rogue states from getting hold of nuclear weapons. Typically, when this discussion started, for instance, in the IAEA or in the EU working groups on non-proliferation, the experts saw this discourse as a clear example of intergovernmental cooperation. requiring a very high level of secrecy and specialization, just for a few people to deal with. But when looking at how proliferation actually takes place in reality, the case of Pakistan is obvious, one still finds out, as has been discussed in the context of homeland security in the United States, the following. One should not exaggerate, of course. A fire brigade is, in the first place, a fire brigade, and it's there to put out fires. But when looking more carefully at what is necessary to build nuclear capabilities, both as regards the platform and the weapon itself, one finds very quickly that there are many surprisingly civilian and normal components, where those who have to be vigilant may be working in universities, banks and border stations, etc. In general, more rule of law, less corruption, etc. can easily be demonstrated as important also in terms of non-proliferation. This has led to research pointing to the need to engage many new categories of staff into the work of preventing proliferation. This also goes for terrorism in general and for organized crime, all overlapping circles, of course. This in turn influences the notion of how you achieve nuclear security and broadens the agenda at nuclear security summits. So when you look at the work of the European Commission, for instance, and more specifically look at non-proliferation, you find out considerations of relevance here affect policies in very many areas. Just look at trade and the influence of dual use and export control regulations on transatlantic trade. A huge issue here also in the context of the trade agreement negotiations with the United States, the TTIP. In fact, when I look closer at the way the private sector adapts to this discourse, I think I'm not alone that I find that a large number of multinational companies need strong in-house expertise in order to manage their relations with governments in areas relating to export controls. So to recapitulate, the importance of strategy and induction on strategies may be to develop and make more explicit analytical and networking links that you didn't see clearly otherwise. What is also interesting, it seems to me, is the linking up of the discourse and strategy with political sociology and psychology, going beyond legal analysis, how things should be, to the political science question, how things are. The issue of perceptions, mindsets, and cognitive frameworks clearly plays a more prominent role in the history of strategy, as depicted in the recent book by Lawrence Friedman. Strategy needs to factor in not only objective conditions for implementation, but also how things are perceived inside and outside the EU. This analysis includes perceptions of the EU as a force for good, perhaps as a fortress Europe, as a party to conflicts, rather than a mediator, etc. Clearly, such perceptions should have major importance, for our strategy should be developed, since the content of the strategy also sets the stage for dialogue. Strategy also importantly, and now I'm at point 8 in the summary of this briefing, focuses the analysis of not just on symptoms and short-term solutions or immediate solutions, but also on root causes. Generally speaking, the more global the strategy is, the more likely you are to be able to identify solutions that could leverage progress in several different areas at the same time. There are many examples of this. One obvious such example is action on climate change, which clearly can bring enormous benefits to fragile countries, impacting on all kinds of different aspects of human security and conflict management. Another example in the geographic context is the overall EU relationship to major countries in the world, the United States, China, etc. The way the EU not only is influenced by US policies, but also influences the way the United States acts in different conflict regions of the world, clearly has enormous importance for a number of key strategic objectives of the Union in the area of foreign and security policy. Developing a comprehensive approach in the Middle East is of course impossible without taking the relations to major powers and the actions of the major powers into account. Or as a third example, and here I'm linking up to two of the priority goals of the global strategy, progress on multilateral cooperation, or in the words of the European Security Strategy from 2003, multilateral effectiveness on the level of regional governance and global governance obviously is key. It's a long-term work, but has enormous importance in a number of specific policy areas. The absence of goals in these areas clearly will make the EU more reactive, more focusing on symptoms and causes, more focusing on internal security, and may actually accentuate the tendency to focus on the EU as a fortress Europe and on the need to defend each and every one of EU member states from negative flows related to globalization. So it is a good way actually to think through beforehand what could happen in the future, taking into account mega trends and the way the EU works in policy cycles over 5 or more years. Strategies also encourage a focus on lessons learned, and for more on this, see my chapter 6 in my handbook. It helps you to define the problems and to see more clearly the end state that you need to plan for, not only in terms of military operations. And perhaps, although this is something many people shy away from in external action, it is a matter of seeing the financial implications and notably the staffing implications of different strategic objectives. I'll come back to this, but frankly, the way the European institutions are governed in terms of focusing on staff reductions unrelated to tasks and objectives, particularly in the external action area, is something which has been under extensive discussion, not least in the context of the review of the External Action Service, which was carried out a couple of years ago. So against this background, and against the background of difficulties to spell out what should be done in the future, it is of course to be expected that strategy language often is a bit self-congratulatory, taking examples of what has already been done or repackaging existing initiatives and programs to fit the new strategic framework. There is, however, a limit to how far one should go and could go in this direction. Political imperatives require that when an office holder is far into his or her mandate, then this is more likely to happen. At the beginning of each cycle, there is typically more of a window of opportunity to call a spade a spade. But if you don't call a spade, of course, the risk is that you will be criticized during the next policy cycle where new incumbent leaders take a fresh look at what has been achieved in the previous period. In the previous briefings about dialogue, I've stressed the importance of starting dialogue at home between member states. This was also the endeavor when the global strategy was produced, although there is, of course, limits to what could be done in this regard. A relatively small number of people in the External Action Service, with the help of a personal advisor to the High Representative, were put to work to develop the strategy in interaction with the think tank community and through various national seminars hosted by foreign ministers and so on. But to subject the global strategy text to negotiation was, of course, again an impossibility, as it was when the European Security Strategy was produced in 2003. So not surprisingly, there have been people criticizing the strategy for not being sufficiently anchored on the level of member states. That's not a surprise. So the work needs to continue, and in my view it will be very important to do it not only on more specialized levels, but also on the level of the European Council itself, composed of the member states on the highest level. They are free to engage in discussions which do not only focus on what the European institutions could and should do, but also what they, as member states, are willing to do both for themselves and in other multilateral contexts. In the absence of global strategy in future crises, one would have most likely seen the same situation as we saw in 2015, when discussing the internal security related to irregular migration and terrorism, and to a certain extent when the European Council put out its strategic conclusions on the Ukraine crisis before that. A mere reference to the need to do something externally. That's not enough, of course. Clearly that is not sufficient. For instance, pointing out the need to finance humanitarian assistance to refugee camps to reduce the level of irregular migration from these camps to Europe is only the beginning of a comprehensive discourse, both on regular and irregular migration. The External Action Service and the Commission thus desperately need strategies for staff to see the big picture at headquarters and certainly in the field. The notion that strategy is for member states and implementation is for the European institutions, in the end, of course, will give the bigger EU member states a total primacy in terms of strategy. In that sense, I suspect that the leaders of many smaller countries in the EU would benefit to go back and look at what real strategic thinkers such as Winston Churchill thought about the value of a united Europe for the future of Europe.